The wrench slipped from her oil-stained fingers as the F-18 Super Hornet's engine bay suddenly erupted in a shower of sparks. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen barely had time to duck before the electrical fire alarm pierced the hangar's morning. Silence. In seconds, what should have been a routine maintenance check had turned into a crisis that would ground the Navy's most advanced fighter jet for weeks. But Sarah wasn't thinking about weeks. She was thinking about the impossible deadline looming over Naval Air Station Oceana, the visiting defense secretary's demonstration flight scheduled for tomorrow, and the fact that she was the only mechanic who had been warning about this exact failure for months. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Now as smoke billowed from the aircraft's belly and her fellow maintenance crew scrambled for fire extinguishers, Sarah realized that everything she had predicted was about to come true in the worst possible way. The morning sun cast long shadows across the flight line at Naval Air Station Oceana as Sarah Chen made her way through the maze of parked aircraft. The smell of jet fuel and hydraulic fluid hung in the air like a familiar perfume, mixed with the salt breeze rolling in from the Atlantic. Her steel-toed boots echoed against the concrete as she navigated between the towering forms of F-18 Super Hornets, each one a testament to American engineering and her own meticulous care. Sarah wore her olive drab coveralls with the same precision she applied to everything else in her life. The fabric was clean despite yesterday's work, pressed despite the early hour, and bore the patches and insignia of someone who had earned her place through sweat and skill rather than connections or politics. Her black hair was pulled back in, a regulation bun, not a strand out of place, and her dark eyes held the focused intensity of someone who saw details others missed. At 28, she had already spent 6 years maintaining the Navy's most sophisticated aircraft. Her hands, though stained with the perpetual marks of her trade, moved with the confidence of someone who understood machines better than most people understood themselves. Every rivet, every wire, every component had a purpose, and Sarah knew them all. She could diagnose problems by sound, predict failures by vibration, and find solutions where others saw only impossibility. The hangar that housed Hornet 774 was already bustling with activity when Sarah arrived. The massive space echoed with the sounds of air compressors, pneumatic tools, and the constant chatter of technicians preparing for another day of maintenance. Fluorescent lights bathed everything in harsh white light, creating sharp shadows beneath the aircraft's wings and fuselage. The smell of coffee mixed with the industrial scents that defined the space where America's defenders were kept airworthy. Sarah's workstation was positioned near the rear of the hangar, close enough to the main floor to stay connected to the day's operations, but far enough from the command area to avoid unnecessary attention. Her tool chest was organized with military precision, each instrument in its designated place, each drawer labeled and sorted according to a system that made sense only to her. Manuals and technical documents were stacked in neat piles, their pages marked with careful annotations in her precise handwriting. The F-18 she had been assigned to maintain was designated Buno 166,789, but everyone called it 774. It was one of the newer Super Hornets in the squadron, equipped with the latest avionics and weapon systems. On paper, it was a perfect machine. In reality, Sarah had been documenting a pattern of anomalies that made her increasingly concerned about its reliability. The problems were subtle at first. A slight vibration in the starboard engine that appeared and disappeared without warning. Intermittent power fluctuations in the flight control system that lasted only seconds but occurred with increasing frequency. Temperature readings that spiked briefly before returning to normal, so quickly that most technicians dismissed them as sensor errors. But Sarah had learned to trust her instincts, and her instincts told her that 774 was developing a serious problem. She had spent weeks documenting these issues, filling out maintenance reports with the methodical thoroughness that had become her trademark. Each incident was recorded with precise timestamps, detailed descriptions, and her recommendations for further investigation. The stack of paperwork grew thicker with each passing day, but the response from higher up the chain remained consistently dismissive. Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez, the maintenance supervisor, was a 20-year veteran who had seen every kind of aircraft malfunction imaginable. His philosophy was simple: if a plane could fly, it was ready for duty. The minor issues Sarah reported fell well within acceptable parameters according to the technical manuals, and in his experience, new mechanics often worried too much about problems that would resolve themselves with time and use. "Chun, you're overthinking it again," he had told her just last week, glancing over her latest report with the expression of someone who had heard similar concerns countless times before. "These birds are built to take a beating. A little vibration never hurt anyone. The engine parameters are well within spec, and the flight control system is passing all its checks. You're looking for problems that aren't there." The other mechanics in the hangar had begun to notice Sarah's reputation for what they called phantom problems. During break-time conversations around the coffee machine, her name had become associated with excessive caution and unnecessary worry. The jokes were never cruel, but they carried the weight of professional judgment among peers who prided themselves on practical experience over theoretical concerns. "There goes Chun again, finding gremlins in the gearbox," someone might say with a chuckle when Sarah submitted another detailed report. Maybe she should transfer to quality control if she wants to nitpick every little thing. The pilots were even less concerned with Sarah's warnings. To them, she was just another maintenance technician, one of dozens who kept their aircraft flying but remained largely invisible to the operational side of naval aviation. When Lieutenant Commander Jackson, 774's primary pilot, was briefed on Sarah's reports, he listened with the polite attention of someone fulfilling a regulatory requirement rather than genuine concern. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Has maintenance cleared the aircraft for flight?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "Yes, sir. All systems are within acceptable parameters, according to the maintenance manual." "Then we're good to go. These mechanics see problems everywhere. It's part of their job to worry, but it's my job to fly. And this bird flies just fine." The squadron's operations officer, Commander Patricia Williams, had similarly dismissed Sarah's concerns when they were brought to her attention through official channels. Williams was a former pilot herself, someone who understood both the technical and operational aspects of naval aviation. She had reviewed Sarah's reports with the thoroughness that her position required, but her conclusion remained unchanged. "Petty Officer Chun is clearly dedicated to her work," Williams had noted in her response to the maintenance supervisor. However, her concerns appear to be based on minor variations that fall within normal operational parameters. All systems tests confirm aircraft readiness, and the pilot reports no handling issues. "We will continue to monitor the situation, but no grounding action is warranted at this time." Sarah's isolation within the maintenance community was compounded by her relatively junior status and her tendency to work independently. While other technicians often collaborated on complex problems, sharing knowledge and dividing responsibilities, Sarah preferred to conduct her own investigations. This approach had served her well in identifying problems that others missed, but it also made her appear aloof to colleagues who valued teamwork and mutual support. The hangar's social dynamics reflected broader patterns within the military. Hierarchy. Experience was valued over innovation, and conformity was often safer than challenging established procedures. Sarah's detailed reports and persistent concerns marked her as someone who didn't understand the unwritten rules of military maintenance. "Do your job. Follow the manual and don't make waves unless absolutely necessary. During the morning briefing sessions, Sarah would sit quietly while supervisors discussed the day's maintenance schedule and operational requirements. Her questions were always technical, focused on specific systems and procedures rather than the broader operational picture. This narrow focus reinforced the impression that she was a competent technician but lacked the practical wisdom that came with experience. "She knows her stuff," Chief Rodriguez would acknowledge when asked about Sarah's performance. "But she needs to learn that not every minor anomaly is a crisis waiting to happen." Experience teaches you to focus on the problems that matter and let the small stuff sort itself out. The morning of the incident began like any other. Sarah arrived at the hangar 30 minutes before her shift, using the quiet time to review her maintenance logs and plan the day's work. 774 was scheduled for a routine inspection before an afternoon training flight, a procedure that should have taken no more than 2 hours to complete. The pre-flight inspection checklist was extensive but familiar. Sarah began with the external examination, walking around the aircraft to check for obvious signs of damage or wear. The Super Hornet's sleek lines and angular surfaces showed no unusual marks or stress indicators. The landing gear appeared solid, the tires properly inflated, and the control surfaces moved smoothly through their full range of motion, moving. To the internal systems, Sarah opened the engine bay access panels and began her examination of the twin General Electric F414 engines. The massive turbofan engines were marvels of engineering, each capable of producing over 22,000 pounds of thrust. Their complex systems of compressors, turbines, and control mechanisms required careful attention to ensure optimal performance. It was during this routine inspection that Sarah noticed the first signs of trouble. The starboard engine's electrical connection showed slight discoloration around several wire harnesses, a subtle indication of heat damage that might have been caused by intermittent arcing. The phenomenon was barely visible, requiring close examination under the bright maintenance lights to detect. Sarah's training had taught her to investigate even minor anomalies, especially when they might indicate larger systemic problems. She began tracing the affected wire harnesses, following their paths through the engine bay to identify potential sources of electrical problems. The work was methodical and time-consuming, requiring her to remove access panels and examine components that were normally left untouched during routine inspections. As she worked, other technicians moved around the hangar, their conversations and activities creating a steady background of noise. The sounds of air tools, metal on metal, and radio chatter filled the space with the familiar rhythm of military maintenance operations. Sarah's focus remained on her investigation, her attention narrowed to the specific problem she was trying to solve. The electrical system in question was part of the engine's full authority digital engine control, a sophisticated computer system that managed fuel flow, ignition timing, and various other parameters essential to proper engine operation. Any malfunction in this system could have serious consequences for flight safety, but the problems Sarah was investigating were subtle and intermittent. Using her multimeter and other diagnostic equipment, Sarah began testing the electrical circuits that controlled the F-18 system. The readings were inconsistent, showing brief fluctuations that occurred unpredictably and lasted only milliseconds. These variations were small enough to remain within acceptable parameters according to the technical manual, but they formed a pattern that suggested a more serious underlying problem. The work required Sarah to disconnect and reconnect various electrical components, a process that temporarily disabled some of the engine's monitoring systems. Standard procedure required her to notify the maintenance supervisor before beginning such work, but Sarah's investigation had revealed the need for immediate attention that couldn't wait for administrative approval. As she worked to isolate the source of the electrical irregularities, Sarah's movements became more urgent. Her experience told her that the problems she was documenting were symptoms of a larger failure that could manifest without warning. The intermittent nature of the issue made it particularly dangerous, as it might occur during critical phases of flight when recovery would be difficult or impossible. The breakthrough came when Sarah discovered that the electrical problems were concentrated in a specific junction box that housed connections for multiple engine control systems. The box itself appeared normal from the outside, but when she removed the cover, she found evidence of significant heat damage to the internal components. Several wire connections showed signs of melting, and the insulation on nearby cables had begun to deteriorate. This discovery confirmed Sarah's worst fears about 774's condition. The damage she had found indicated a serious electrical fault that could cause complete engine failure without warning. The intermittent nature of the problem meant that it might not be detected during ground testing but could manifest during flight operations when the electrical systems were under maximum stress. Sarah's hands moved quickly as she began documenting her findings with photographs and detailed measurements. The evidence was clear and undeniable. 774 had a critical safety defect that required immediate grounding and extensive repairs. The aircraft could not be safely operated until the electrical system was completely rebuilt and tested. But as Sarah worked to complete her documentation, she realized that her discovery had come at the worst possible time. The morning's flight schedule was already in motion, and 774 was designated for an important training mission that afternoon. The squadron's operations were built around the assumption that the aircraft would be available, and any grounding action would have significant operational consequences. Moreover, Sarah's history of reporting phantom problems had undermined her credibility with the maintenance supervisors and operations staff. Her previous warnings about 774 had been dismissed as excessive caution, and she knew that her current findings would likely be met with skepticism and resistance. The morning briefing was already underway when Sarah made her decision to interrupt the proceedings with her discovery. The maintenance supervisor, operations officer, and senior technicians were gathered around a table covered with flight schedules and maintenance logs. Their conversation focused on the day's operational requirements. "Chief Rodriguez," Sarah said, her voice carrying the urgency she felt but maintaining the respectful tone required by military protocol. "I need to report a critical safety defect in 774. The aircraft needs to be grounded immediately." The conversation around the table stopped as all eyes turned to Sarah. Her coveralls were more disheveled than usual, her hands marked with fresh oil stains from her investigation. The stack of photographs and documentation she carried looked substantial, but her colleague's expression showed more annoyance than concern. "What kind of defect?" Rodriguez asked, his tone suggesting that he expected another minor issue that had been blown out of proportion. Sarah spread her photographs across the table, pointing to the evidence of heat damage and electrical failures she had discovered. Her explanation was technically detailed and thoroughly documented, but she could see the skepticism in her listeners' faces. The problems she described were serious but complex, requiring technical knowledge to fully understand their implications. "The electrical junction box for the F-18 system shows extensive heat damage," she continued. "The wire connections are deteriorating, and the insulation is compromised. This could cause complete engine failure without warning." Commander Williams examined the photographs with the attention that protocol required, but her expression remained skeptical. The evidence Sarah presented was genuine, but the implications seemed excessive given the aircraft's recent performance. "History. Has this problem affected the aircraft's operation?" Williams asked. "Are there any pilot reports of engine anomalies or handling issues?" "No, ma'am," Sarah admitted. "The problem is intermittent and may not manifest during normal ground testing. But the damage is progressive and could result in catastrophic failure during flight operations." The maintenance supervisor studied the photographs more carefully, his expression showing the conflict between his respect for Sarah's technical skills and his skepticism about her tendency to overstate problems. The evidence was concerning, but the aircraft had been flying safely for months, despite the minor anomalies Sarah had been reporting. How long would it take to repair this problem? Rodriguez asked, already calculating the operational impact of grounding 774. At least a week, Sarah replied. The entire electrical harness would need to be replaced, and the engine would require extensive testing before return to service. The silence that followed Sarah's estimate was heavy with the weight of operational reality. 774 was scheduled for multiple training flights over the next several days, including a high-profile demonstration for visiting defense officials. Grounding the aircraft would disrupt squadron operations and potentially embarrass the command in front of senior leadership. I'll need to consult with the squadron commander, William said finally. In the meantime, continue with the scheduled inspection. If the aircraft passes all standard tests, we'll proceed with today's flight operations while we evaluate your findings. Sarah's heart sank as she realized that her warnings were being dismissed once again. The evidence she had gathered was compelling, but the operational pressures and her own reputation for excessive caution had undermined her credibility. 774 would continue flying despite the critical safety defect she had discovered. As the briefing concluded and the hangar returned to its normal rhythm of activity, Sarah found herself increasingly isolated. Her colleagues were polite, but distant, their conversations avoiding any mention of her dramatic announcement. The photographers and documentation she had prepared were filed away for further review, but the aircraft continued its preparation for the afternoon's training. Flight. Lieutenant Commander Jackson arrived for his pre-flight briefing with the confidence of someone who had flown 774 dozens of times without incident. His conversation with the maintenance supervisor was brief and routine, focusing on the aircraft's readiness rather than the technical concerns Sarah had raised. Any maintenance issues I should know about? Jackson asked, performing the pilot's standard inquiry about aircraft condition. Petty Officer Chen reported some electrical concerns, Rodriguez replied, his tone suggesting that the issues were minor. But all systems tests are normal, and the aircraft is cleared for flight. Jackson nodded, accepting the assessment without further questions. His experience had taught him to trust the maintenance professionals who kept his aircraft airworthy. And the technical details of Sarah's findings were beyond his area of expertise. The afternoon flight proceeded without incident, reinforcing the impression that Sarah's concerns were unfounded. 774 performed normally throughout the training mission, its engines operating smoothly and its systems functioning within acceptable parameters. The successful completion of the flight was seen as vindication of the decision to proceed despite Sarah's warnings. But Sarah knew that the successful flight proved nothing about the aircraft's underlying safety. The electrical problems she had discovered were intermittent and unpredictable, capable of manifesting without warning during future operations. The heat damage she had documented was progressive, meaning that the system would continue to deteriorate until catastrophic failure became inevitable. Over the following days, Sarah continued her investigation of 774's electrical systems, working during off-duty hours to gather additional evidence of the aircraft's problems. Her efforts were thorough and professional, but they were conducted in an atmosphere of growing skepticism from her colleagues and supervisors. The other mechanics in the hangar had begun to refer to Sarah's work as ghost hunting, a term that captured their belief that she was chasing problems that existed only in her imagination. The jokes were gentle but persistent, creating an environment where Sarah's technical concerns were viewed with amusement rather than respect. Chun's at it again, someone might say when Sarah was seen working on 774 during her lunch break. Maybe she should write a horror story about haunted aircraft instead of maintenance reports. The pilots were even less interested in Sarah's continuing investigation. To them, she represented the kind of overzealous technician who created problems where none existed, threatening operational readiness with unnecessary caution. Lieutenant Commander Jackson had mentioned Sarah's concerns to other pilots in casual conversation, but his tone suggested that her warnings were more of a curiosity than a serious safety issue. "We've got a mechanic who thinks 774 is going to explode," he had said with a chuckle. "She's been writing reports about electrical problems that nobody else can find. Classic case of someone who reads too many technical manuals and not enough flight experience." The squadron's leadership was aware of Sarah's continuing concerns, but their focus remained on operational readiness rather than theoretical safety issues. The aircraft continued to pass all required inspections and tests, and its flight performance remained within acceptable parameters. From their perspective, Sarah's warnings represented the kind of excessive caution that could paralyze operations if taken too seriously. Commander Williams had reviewed Sarah's additional documentation with the thoroughness that her position required, but her conclusion remained unchanged. The evidence of electrical problems was genuine, but not severe enough to warrant grounding. Action. The aircraft's continued safe operation demonstrated that the issues Sarah had identified were manageable within existing maintenance procedures. Petty Officer Chen's dedication to safety is commendable, Williams noted in her written response to the maintenance supervisor. However, her concerns appear to be based on theoretical risks rather than demonstrated operational problems. The aircraft continues to meet all safety requirements and performance standards. Sarah's isolation within the maintenance community was compounded by her refusal to accept the official assessment of 774's condition. While other technicians moved on to different assignments and new challenges, Sarah remained focused on the electrical problem she had discovered. Her persistence was admirable from a technical standpoint, but it marked her as someone who couldn't adapt to the practical realities of military operations. The hangar's social dynamics reflected the broader challenge of balancing safety concerns with operational requirements. Sarah's detailed analysis and persistent warnings represented the kind of technical perfectionism that could improve safety but also threatened the practical compromises that made military operations possible. As the days passed, Sarah's reputation evolved from that of an overzealous technician to someone who might be fundamentally unsuited for military maintenance work. Her inability to accept the official assessment of 774's condition was seen as a sign of poor judgment rather than dedication to safety. The morning briefings continued to include updates on Sarah's investigation, but the tone of these discussions had shifted from concern to resignation. Her findings were documented and filed, but they were no longer treated as urgent safety issues requiring immediate attention. Chen's still working on her electrical theory, Rodriguez might report during the daily maintenance meeting. But the bird keeps flying, and all our tests come back normal. At some point, we have to trust our procedures and move on. The other mechanics nodded in agreement, their expressions showing the weariness of professionals who had seen similar situations before. Sarah's technical skills were respected, but her inability to accept the limits of practical maintenance was seen as a character flaw that would limit her career prospects. Sarah's work continued despite the growing skepticism around her. She spent hours reviewing technical manuals, studying electrical schematics, and conducting additional tests on 774's systems. Her investigation had expanded beyond the original electrical problems to include a comprehensive analysis of the aircraft's overall condition. The results of this expanded investigation were even more concerning than Sarah's original findings. The electrical problems she had discovered were symptoms of a broader design flaw that affected multiple systems throughout the aircraft. The heat damage was not isolated to a single junction box, but extended throughout the electrical network, creating multiple points of potential failure. Sarah's documentation of these problems filled several thick binders, each page marked with her careful analysis and detailed recommendations. The scope of her investigation was impressive from a technical standpoint, but it also reinforced the impression that she was pursuing problems that existed only in her imagination. The aircraft's continued safe operation served as a daily reminder that Sarah's concerns were not supported by operational reality. 774 flew multiple training missions each week, its performance remaining consistent with squadron standards. The pilots reported no handling issues, and the aircraft systems continued to pass all required tests. But Sarah knew that the absence of obvious problems did not mean that the aircraft was safe. The electrical issues she had discovered were progressive and unpredictable, capable of causing catastrophic failure without warning. The longer 774 continued to operate with these defects, the greater the risk of a disaster that could be prevented only by immediate grounding and extensive repairs. Her frustration was compounded by the knowledge that her technical analysis was correct, but her conclusions were being dismissed. The evidence she had gathered was thorough and compelling, but it was being evaluated within a system that prioritized operational readiness over theoretical safety concerns. The morning of the incident that would change everything began with the same routine that had characterized Sarah's work for months. She arrived at the hangar early, reviewed her maintenance logs, and prepared for another day of investigation and documentation. 774 was scheduled for routine inspection before an important demonstration flight, a procedure that should have been completed without incident. But as Sarah began her examination of the aircraft's electrical systems, she discovered that the problems she had been documenting had reached a critical threshold. The heat damage was more extensive than ever before, and several wire connections showed signs of imminent failure. The electrical system that controlled the engine's operation was on the verge of complete breakdown. Sarah's hands moved quickly as she began testing the affected circuits, her multimeter readings confirming her worst fears. The electrical faults that had been intermittent and unpredictable were now constant and severe. 774's starboard engine was operating on borrowed time, its control systems held together by increasingly fragile connections that could fail at any moment. The discovery filled Sarah with a mixture of vindication and dread. Her months of warnings had been proven correct, but the validation had come at the worst possible time. The aircraft was scheduled for a high-profile demonstration in just hours, and the operational pressures that had dismissed her previous concerns would make it even more difficult to ground the aircraft now. But Sarah knew that she could not allow 774 to fly with such critical defects. The evidence of impending failure was overwhelming, and the risk of catastrophic engine failure during flight was unacceptable. Her duty as a maintenance technician required her to ground the aircraft regardless of the operational consequences. As she worked to complete her documentation of the critical defects, Sarah realized that her months of persistence had led to this moment. The phantom problems she had been accused of chasing were about to become very real, and the aircraft that everyone believed was safe was actually a disaster waiting to happen. The morning sun continued to stream through the hangar windows as Sarah prepared to make her final report on 774's condition. The aircraft sat quietly on the maintenance floor, its sleek lines and powerful engines giving no external indication of the critical problems hidden within its electrical systems. Sarah knew that her announcement would be met with skepticism and resistance, but she also knew that she had no choice. The evidence was overwhelming, and the risk was unacceptable. 774 could not be allowed to fly until its electrical systems were completely rebuilt and tested. The moment she had been preparing for during months of investigation had finally arrived. The aircraft that everyone believed was safe was actually on the verge of catastrophic failure, and Sarah was the only person who understood the true extent of the danger. As she gathered her documentation and prepared to interrupt the morning briefing, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility that came with her knowledge. The operational pressures and social dynamics that had dismissed her previous warnings would make her task even more difficult. But the safety of the aircrew and the aircraft itself depended on her ability to communicate the urgent reality of 774's condition. The hangar continued its routine activities around her, but Sarah knew that everything was about to change. The aircraft that had been flying safely for months was actually a ticking time bomb, and she was the only person who could prevent the disaster that was about to unfold. The morning briefing was about to begin when Sarah made her decision to act. The maintenance supervisor, operations officer, and senior technicians were gathering around their usual table. Their conversation focused on the day's operational requirements and the important demonstration flight scheduled for that afternoon. Sarah's approach was deliberate and professional, her documentation organized and her explanation prepared. She knew that her credibility had been undermined by months of phantom problems, but she also knew that the evidence she carried was undeniable. 774's electrical systems were on the verge of complete failure, and the aircraft could not be safely operated until extensive repairs were completed. The moment of truth had arrived, and Sarah stepped forward to deliver the warning that would either save lives or end her career. The aircraft that everyone believed was safe was actually a disaster waiting to happen, and she was the only person standing between the aircrew and catastrophic failure. The hangar fell silent as Sarah began to speak, her voice carrying the urgency of someone who had spent months preparing for this moment. The documentation she spread across the table told the story of an aircraft in crisis, its electrical systems held together by increasingly fragile connections that could fail without warning. But as Sarah looked into the faces of her colleagues and supervisors, she saw the same skepticism that had met her previous warnings. The operational pressures that had dismissed her concerns for months were still present, and the important demonstration flight scheduled for that afternoon would make grounding the aircraft even more difficult. The morning sun continued to stream through the hangar windows as Sarah delivered her final warning about 774's condition. The aircraft sat quietly on the maintenance floor, its sleek lines and powerful engines giving no indication of the critical problems hidden within its electrical systems. Sarah knew that her announcement would be met with resistance, but she also knew that she had no choice. The evidence was overwhelming and the risk was unacceptable. 774 could not be allowed to fly until its electrical systems were completely rebuilt and tested. The moment she had been preparing for during months of investigation had finally arrived. The aircraft that everyone believed was safe was actually on the verge of catastrophic failure, and Sarah was the only person who understood the true extent of the danger. As she stood before her colleagues and supervisors, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility that came with her knowledge. The operational pressures and social dynamics that had dismissed her previous warnings would make her task even more difficult. But the safety of the aircrew and the aircraft itself depended on her ability to communicate the urgent reality of 774's condition. The hangar continued its routine activities around her, but Sarah knew that everything was about to change. The aircraft that had been flying safely for months was actually a ticking time bomb, and she was the only person who could prevent the disaster that was about to unfold. The morning briefing concluded with the same dismissive tone that had characterized every discussion about 774's condition over the past several months. Sarah watched as her colleagues dispersed back to their various assignments, their conversations already shifting to more pressing concerns than her latest report about electrical anomalies. The documentation she had prepared with such care was stacked neatly on Chief Rodriguez's desk, destined for another round of administrative review that would likely yield the same conclusions as before. But this time was different, though none of them knew it yet. The electrical problems Sarah had been documenting were no longer theoretical risks or minor variations within acceptable parameters. They had crossed a critical threshold during the Koskonga Night, transforming from manageable maintenance issues into an imminent threat that could manifest without warning. The aircraft that everyone believed was safe to fly was actually balanced on the edge of catastrophic failure. Sarah returned to 774 with a sense of dread that she couldn't shake. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the engine bay access panels, knowing that what she would find would either vindicate months of warnings or prove once. And for all that, her concerns were unfounded. The morning light streaming through the hangar's windows cast harsh shadows across the aircraft's internal systems, creating a stark contrast between the areas she could see clearly and those hidden in darkness. The first indication of trouble was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone who hadn't spent months studying the aircraft's electrical systems. A faint burning smell lingered in the air around the starboard engine, barely detectable beneath the usual odors of fuel and hydraulic fluid that permeated the hangar. Sarah's trained nose caught the scent immediately, recognizing it as the distinctive smell of overheated electrical insulation. She retrieved her flashlight and began a systematic examination of the engine bay, focusing on the areas where she had previously documented heat damage. What she found exceeded her worst expectations. The wire harnesses that had shown minor discoloration just days before were now severely damaged, their insulation cracked and brittle from repeated thermal stress. Several connections showed clear evidence of arcing, with metallic deposits on nearby surfaces indicating that electrical faults had been occurring regularly. The junction box that housed the critical engine control connections was in even worse condition than Sarah had anticipated. When she removed the cover, she discovered that multiple wire connections had partially separated, held together only by their corroded metal cores. The internal components showed extensive heat damage, with plastic housings warped and discolored from exposure to temperatures far beyond their design limits. Sarah's multimeter readings confirmed what the visual evidence already suggested. The electrical resistance in several critical circuits had increased dramatically, forcing the system to draw more current to maintain proper operation. This increased current flow generated additional heat, accelerating the degradation process and creating a dangerous feedback loop that could only end in complete system failure. The implications of her discovery were staggering. The full authority digital engine control system that managed the starboard engine's operation was operating far outside its design parameters, compensating for electrical faults that grew worse with each flight. The engine's ability to maintain stable operation depended on increasingly fragile connections that could fail at any moment, potentially causing catastrophic engine failure during critical phases of flight. Sarah's documentation of the critical defects was methodical and thorough, but her movements were increasingly urgent as the scope of the problem became clear. She photographed each damaged component from multiple angles, recorded electrical measurements that showed the system's deteriorating condition, and prepared a detailed analysis that left no doubt about the aircraft's dangerous condition. As she worked, the hangar around her continued its normal rhythm of activity. Other technicians performed routine maintenance on their assigned aircraft, their conversations and activities creating a steady background of noise that masked the significance of Sarah's discovery. The morning's flight schedule proceeded as planned, with pilots arriving for their briefings and ground crews preparing aircraft for departure. Lieutenant Commander Jackson was scheduled to fly 774 that afternoon for a training mission. That would be followed by the high-profile demonstration flight the next day. His pre-flight briefing was routine and confident, focused on the mission objectives rather than any technical concerns about the aircraft's condition. When asked about maintenance issues, Chief Rodriguez provided the standard assurance that all systems had been inspected and found satisfactory. But Sarah knew that this routine assessment was based on incomplete information. The critical electrical faults she had discovered had developed rapidly, reaching dangerous levels only in the past few hours. The standard inspection procedures and testing protocols were not designed to detect such rapidly evolving problems, leaving a dangerous gap between the aircraft's apparent condition and its actual safety status. The sense of urgency that drove Sarah's investigation was compounded by the knowledge that time was running out. 774 was scheduled to begin its pre-flight preparations within hours, and once the aircraft was cleared for departure, any attempt to ground it would face enormous operational and political pressure. The demonstration flight scheduled for the following day involved senior defense officials and represented a significant opportunity for the squadron to showcase its capabilities. Sarah's attempts to communicate the urgency of her findings were frustrated by the same institutional dynamics that had dismissed her previous warnings. Her reputation for excessive caution had created a credibility gap that made it difficult for others to take her concerns seriously, especially when those concerns involved grounding an aircraft that appeared to be operating normally. The maintenance supervisor's response to Sarah's latest report was predictably skeptical. Chief Rodriguez examined the photographs and documentation with the attention that protocol required, but his expression showed the weariness of someone who had dealt with similar alarms before. The evidence of electrical problems was undeniable, but the aircraft's continued safe operation suggested that the issues were manageable within existing procedures. "How long has this damage been developing?" Rodriguez asked, studying the photographs that showed the deteriorated wire connections. "The process has been accelerating over the past several weeks," Sarah replied. "But the critical threshold was crossed sometime during the night. The system is now operating far outside safe parameters." Rodriguez's examination of the technical data was thorough but focused on regulatory compliance rather than operational risk. The electrical measurements Sarah had recorded were concerning, but they didn't clearly violate the specific limits established in the maintenance manual. The aircraft's continued ability to pass ground testing suggested that the problems might be manageable through increased monitoring rather than immediate grounding. "What's your recommendation?" Rodriguez asked, though his tone suggested that he already anticipated Sarah's response. "The aircraft must be grounded immediately," Sarah said without hesitation. "The electrical system is on the verge of complete failure. Continued operation presents an unacceptable risk of catastrophic engine failure during flight." The silence that followed Sarah's recommendation was heavy with the weight of operational reality. Grounding 774 would disrupt the afternoon's training schedule and potentially jeopardize the next day's demonstration flight. The political and professional consequences of such a decision would be significant, especially if the grounding proved to be unnecessary. Rodriguez's dilemma reflected the broader challenge of balancing safety concerns with operational requirements in a military environment. Sarah's technical analysis was compelling, but her history of excessive caution raised questions about whether her latest concerns were justified by the actual risk level. The aircraft's continued safe operation provided evidence that contradicted her dire predictions. The decision to seek additional opinions was a reasonable response to the conflicting evidence. Rodriguez arranged for a senior technician from another squadron to conduct an independent assessment of 774's condition, hoping to get an objective evaluation that could resolve the dispute between Sarah's warnings and the aircraft's apparent operational readiness. Master Chief Petty Officer Williams arrived at the hangar within an hour of Rodriguez's request. Her 25 years of experience with Navy aircraft maintenance had given her a reputation for practical wisdom and sound judgment. She was known for her ability to distinguish between genuine safety concerns and the kind of excessive caution that could paralyze operations. Williams's examination of 774 was systematic and thorough, but her approach was different from Sarah's detailed analysis. She focused on the aircraft's overall condition and operational history rather than the specific electrical anomalies that had captured Sarah's attention. Her assessment was based on the practical experience that came from maintaining aircraft. under real-world conditions. The electrical system shows some wear, Williams acknowledged after completing her inspection. But nothing that appears immediately dangerous. These birds are built to handle much worse conditions than what I'm seeing here. Sarah's frustration was evident as she tried to explain the significance of the electrical faults to someone whose assessment was based on different criteria. The heat damage and connection deterioration that seemed critical to her were viewed by Williams as normal wear that could be managed through routine maintenance procedures. The resistance measurements show the system is operating far outside design parameters, Sarah insisted, pointing to her documentation. The thermal stress is causing accelerating damage that will lead to complete failure. Williams's response reflected the tension between theoretical analysis and practical experience that often characterized maintenance decisions. I've seen plenty of aircraft with similar electrical issues that continued to operate safely for months or even years. The manual gives us acceptable ranges for a reason, and this bird is still within those ranges. The disagreement between Sarah and Williams represented more than just different interpretations of technical data. It reflected fundamentally different approaches to risk assessment and safety management. Sarah's analysis was based on engineering principles and failure mode analysis, while Williams's assessment relied on operational experience and statistical probability. The squadron's leadership was informed of the conflicting assessments and faced the difficult decision of how to proceed. Commander Patricia Williams, the operations officer, was responsible for balancing safety concerns with operational requirements. Her decision would have significant consequences regardless of which assessment proved correct. The afternoon training flight proceeded as scheduled despite Sarah's objections. Lieutenant Commander Jackson completed his pre-flight briefing and inspection with the confidence of someone who trusted the maintenance professionals responsible for his aircraft's condition. The apparent normalcy of the pre-flight procedures masked the underlying tension about 774's electrical problems. Sarah watched from the hangar as Jackson conducted his external inspection of the aircraft, checking control surfaces and looking for obvious signs of damage or wear. His examination was thorough but focused on visible problems rather than the hidden electrical faults that concerned her. The pre-flight inspection procedures were not designed to detect the kind of internal system degradation that Sarah had documented. The engine startup sequence proceeded normally, with both F-414 engines spooling up to operational parameters without obvious problems. The electrical faults that Sarah had discovered were not immediately apparent during ground operations, as the engine control systems were designed to compensate for minor variations in electrical supply. The aircraft's apparent readiness for flight reinforced the impression that Sarah's concerns were excessive. But Sarah knew that the real test would come during flight operations, when the electrical systems would be subjected to the full range of operational stresses. The thermal cycling, vibration, and electromagnetic interference encountered during flight could trigger the catastrophic failure that her analysis predicted. The aircraft might appear ready for departure, but it was actually carrying a hidden time bomb in its electrical system. Jackson's taxi to the runway was routine and uneventful, with 774 responding normally to control inputs and showing no signs of the electrical problems that had consumed Sarah's attention for months. The ground controllers cleared the aircraft for departure with the standard efficiency that characterized naval flight operations. To all external observers, 774 was just another Navy fighter preparing for a routine training mission. The takeoff roll and initial climb appeared normal from Sarah's vantage point in the hangar. 774 accelerated down the runway with the powerful thrust of its twin engines, lifting off smoothly and climbing into the afternoon sky. The aircraft's performance seemed to contradict every warning that Sarah had issued about its dangerous condition. But 15 minutes into the flight, Sarah's worst fears began to materialize. The first indication of trouble came through the radio communications between Jackson and the control tower. His voice, normally calm and professional, carried a note of concern as he reported an unexpected engine parameter indication. Tower, Hornet 774 is showing a caution light on the starboard engine. Engine parameters appear normal, but I'm getting intermittent warnings from the engine control system. The tower's response was routine and professional, but Sarah could hear the underlying tension as controllers began to take a heightened interest in 774's status. Engine problems during flight were always serious, but the intermittent nature of Jackson's reports made it difficult to assess the actual severity of the situation. Sarah's heart raced as she listened to the radio communications, knowing that the symptoms Jackson was reporting matched exactly what her analysis had predicted. The electrical faults in the engine control system were beginning to manifest under flight conditions, causing intermittent warnings and parameter variations that could escalate rapidly into complete system failure. The maintenance crew in the hangar gathered around the radio as Jackson's reports became more frequent and concerning. The engine caution lights were accompanied by fluctuating temperature and pressure readings that suggested the control system was struggling to maintain stable operation. The symptoms were subtle but persistent, creating a pattern that experienced maintenance personnel recognized as potentially serious. Chief Rodriguez's expression showed the conflict between his desire to support the pilot and his growing concern about the aircraft's condition. The problems Jackson was reporting were consistent with Sarah's warnings, but they were also within the range of minor malfunctions that could often be resolved through routine procedures. Hornet 774, can you confirm engine parameters are within normal ranges? The tower asked, seeking clarification about the aircraft's actual condition. Jackson's response revealed the pilot's own uncertainty about the severity of the situation. Parameters are fluctuating but generally within limits. The engine appears to be running normally, but the control system warnings are becoming more frequent. Sarah knew that Jackson's description masked the true danger of his situation. The electrical faults she had discovered were causing the engine control system to operate in a degraded mode, compensating for failing connections through increased current flow and thermal stress. The system might maintain apparent stability for a while, but the underlying problems were accelerating toward complete failure. The decision to continue the training mission reflected the same institutional biases that had dismissed Sarah's warnings throughout the morning. Jackson was an experienced pilot flying an aircraft that appeared to be operating within acceptable parameters. The intermittent warnings were concerning but not immediately threatening, and the mission objectives could still be accomplished safely. But Sarah's understanding of the aircraft's electrical problems gave her a different perspective on the developing situation. The symptoms Jackson was reporting were early indicators of the catastrophic failure she had predicted. The electrical connections that were barely holding together during ground operations were now subjected to the additional stresses of flight, accelerating their deterioration toward the point of complete breakdown. The training mission continued for another 20 minutes, with Jackson completing his assigned objectives while monitoring the increasingly erratic behavior of the starboard engine control system. His reports to the tower became more frequent as the warnings multiplied and the engine parameters showed greater variation from normal values. Tower 774 is experiencing increasing electrical anomalies in the starboard engine. I'm seeing multiple caution lights and parameter fluctuations. Requesting permission to return to base for inspection. The tower's approval of Jackson's request was immediate, reflecting the controller's growing concern about the aircraft's condition. The apparent routine of the training mission had given way to the focused attention that always accompanied potential aircraft emergencies. Ground crews were alerted to prepare for Jackson's return, and emergency vehicles were positioned along the runway as a precautionary measure. Sarah's vindication came with a mixture of relief and dread. Her months of warnings about 774's electrical problems were finally being proven correct, but the validation was occurring under the worst possible circumstances. Jackson was flying an aircraft with critical system failures, and his safe return was far from guaranteed. The approach and landing phase would be the most dangerous part of Jackson's flight, as the electrical problems that had been manageable during cruise flight could become catastrophic during the high-stress operations required for carrier landing. The engine control system's degraded condition made it vulnerable to complete failure at the worst possible moment. Jackson's approach to the runway was more cautious than usual, reflecting his awareness that 774 was operating with compromised systems. His radio communications revealed the pilot's professional calm despite the increasingly serious nature of his aircraft's problems. The starboard engine was still producing thrust, but the control system warnings had become almost constant. Tower, 774 on final approach. Engine is still running, but control system is extremely unstable. Standing by for emergency procedures if needed. The tension in the hangar was palpable as Sarah and her colleagues listened to Jackson's approach communications. The aircraft that had departed as a routine training flight was returning as a potential emergency, validating Sarah's warnings in the most dramatic way possible. The landing itself was smooth and professional, with Jackson demonstrating the skill and experience that had made him one of the squadron's most trusted pilots. 774 touched down on the center line and rolled out normally, but the relief in Jackson's voice was evident as he reported his safe arrival. Tower, 774 is down safely. Requesting immediate maintenance inspection of the starboard engine control system. Multiple caution lights and parameter anomalies throughout the flight. The aircraft's taxi back to the hangar was accompanied by the heightened attention that always followed potential emergency situations. Ground crews were standing by to secure the aircraft and begin immediate investigation of the reported problems. The routine nature of the morning's departure had been replaced by the focused urgency of a developing crisis. Sarah's role in the unfolding drama was complicated by her previous warnings about 774's condition. Her predictions had been proven accurate, but the vindication came at the cost of demonstrating that a dangerous aircraft had been allowed to fly despite clear evidence of critical problems. The institutional dynamics that had dismissed her concerns were now exposed as potentially catastrophic failures of judgment. Jackson's post-flight debriefing revealed the full extent of the problems he had encountered during the training mission. The starboard engine had experienced multiple control system failures, with warning lights, parameter fluctuations, and intermittent loss of normal engine response. The aircraft had remained flyable throughout the mission, but the pilot's workload had increased dramatically as he managed the degrading systems. The engine never actually failed, Jackson reported to the maintenance debrief, but the control system was all over the place. I had constant warnings, temperature and pressure readings that kept jumping around, and several moments where the engine didn't respond normally to throttle inputs. Sarah's analysis of Jackson's description confirmed her understanding of the electrical problems that had caused the crisis. The failing wire connections in the engine control system had created the exact symptoms that her months of investigation had predicted. The aircraft's ability to complete the flight safely was more a matter of luck than design, as the critical electrical faults could have caused complete engine failure at any moment. The immediate grounding of 774 was inevitable. Once Jackson's flight experience validated Sarah's technical concerns, the aircraft could not be allowed to fly again until the electrical problems were completely resolved, regardless of the operational consequences. The demonstration flight, scheduled for the next day, would have to be canceled or assigned to a different aircraft. Chief Rodriguez's response to the developing crisis reflected the difficult position of someone whose professional judgment had been called into question. His dismissal of Sarah's warnings had been based on reasonable assessment of available evidence, but the flight's outcome suggested that his evaluation had been dangerously wrong. "We need a complete electrical system inspection," Rodriguez announced to the maintenance crew. "I want every connection, every wire, every component checked and documented. This aircraft doesn't fly again until we understand exactly what happened." Up there, Sarah's vindication was complete but bittersweet. Her months of warnings about 774's electrical problems had been proven correct in the most dramatic way possible. But the validation had come at the cost of demonstrating serious failures in the maintenance and operational decision-making process. An aircraft with critical safety defects had been allowed to fly despite clear evidence of dangerous problems. The investigation that followed Jackson's emergency return would examine not only the technical failures that had caused the crisis, but also the institutional failures that had allowed those problems to persist. Sarah's documentation of the electrical faults would be central to understanding how the situation had developed and why her warnings had been dismissed. The hangar's atmosphere had changed dramatically from the routine confidence of the morning to the focused urgency of a major maintenance crisis. 774 sat on the flight line like a wounded bird, its external appearance giving no indication of the critical problems hidden within its electrical systems. The aircraft that had been dismissed as mechanically sound was now revealed as a potential disaster that had narrowly avoided catastrophe. Sarah's role in the unfolding investigation was complicated by her previous isolation within the maintenance community. Her vindication had transformed her from an overly cautious mechanic into the person who had identified critical safety problems that others had missed. The transformation was professionally satisfying but personally awkward, as it highlighted the institutional failures that had nearly caused a catastrophic accident. The afternoon's events had proven that Sarah's technical analysis was not only correct but prophetic. The electrical problems she had documented over months of investigation had developed exactly as her engineering knowledge had predicted. Aircraft that everyone believed was safe had been operating on borrowed time, with critical systems held together by increasingly fragile connections. The implications of the crisis extended far beyond 774's immediate condition. The incident raised serious questions about maintenance procedures, decision-making processes, and the institutional culture that had dismissed legitimate safety concerns. Sarah's vindication was complete, but it came with this sobering realization that similar problems might exist throughout the fleet. As the investigation began and 774 was secured for detailed inspection, Sarah found herself at the center of a rapidly expanding crisis that would test everything she had learned about aircraft maintenance, institutional dynamics, and her own professional courage. The aircraft she had been warning about for months was finally getting the attention it deserved, but the cost of that attention was higher than anyone had anticipated. The crisis was far from over, and Sarah knew that the most challenging part of her ordeal was yet to come. The emergency klaxon pierced the afternoon air at Naval Air Station Oceana as Lieutenant Commander Jackson's voice crackled through the radio with words that sent chills through everyone listening. "Mayday, Mayday, Tower, this is Hornet 774. Declaring an emergency. Complete electrical failure in starboard engine, losing control authority. Requesting immediate assistance for emergency landing." Sarah's blood ran cold as she heard the transmission from her position near the maintenance radio. This was exactly what she had predicted, but hearing it unfold in real time was far worse than any theoretical analysis could have prepared her. 4. Jackson was fighting for his life 30,000 feet above the base, trapped in an aircraft whose critical systems were failing in precisely the catastrophic manner she had warned about for months. The tower's response was immediate and professional, but Sarah could hear the underlying tension as controllers began coordinating emergency procedures. "Hornet 774, roger your mayday. Emergency vehicles are rolling, we're clearing. The pattern for your approach. State your intentions and fuel remaining." Jackson's reply was strained, his voice tight with the effort of controlling an aircraft that was rapidly becoming unflyable. Tower, I'm showing complete FADIC failure. On the starboard engine. Engine is running but not responding to throttle inputs. Port engine is compensating, but I'm getting intermittent warnings there too. Fuel remaining is 4,000 pounds, enough for one approach. In the maintenance hangar, Chief Rodriguez stood frozen beside the radio, his face pale as the implications of Jackson's emergency became clear. The electrical problems that Sarah had been documenting were not just causing warning lights and parameter fluctuations. They had progressed to complete system failure, leaving Jackson with an engine that was producing thrust but could not be controlled. Sarah stepped forward without hesitation. Her months of investigation suddenly transformed from theoretical concern into practical knowledge that could save a pilot's life. She knew 774's electrical systems better than anyone, understood the failure modes that were occurring, and had spent countless hours analyzing potential solutions to exactly this type of emergency. "Chief, I need to talk to Jackson," Sarah said, her voice carrying an authority that had been absent during months of dismissed warnings. "I know what's happening to that aircraft, and I know how to help him." Rodriguez's initial instinct was to defer to more senior personnel, but the urgency of the situation and Sarah's demonstrated expertise with 774's problems made the decision easy. He handed her the radio headset without hesitation, recognizing that her detailed knowledge of the aircraft's electrical systems made her the most qualified person to provide assistance. Sarah's voice was calm and steady as she keyed the microphone, her tone carrying the confidence of someone who had prepared for this moment through months of careful analysis. "Jackson, this is Petty Officer Chen in maintenance. I've been studying the electrical problems in 774, and I know what you're dealing with up there." The relief in Jackson's voice was evident as he responded to Sarah's transmission. "Shun, thank God, this bird is barely flying. The starboard engine is running, but I have no throttle control, and the port engine is starting to show similar symptoms. What am I looking at here?" Sarah's explanation was precise and technical, but delivered in terms that a pilot could understand and act upon. "The FADIC system has lost electrical control due to wire harness failures I've been tracking. The engines will continue to run at their current power settings, but you won't be able to change thrust normally. You're going to need to use alternative procedures for approach and landing." The maintenance hangar had filled with personnel as word of the emergency spread throughout the base. Senior officers, experienced technicians, and support staff gathered around the radio to listen to Sarah's communication with Jackson. Her calm professionalism and detailed knowledge of the aircraft's problems commanded immediate respect from people who had previously dismissed her concerns. Jackson's questions came rapidly as he worked to understand his aircraft's degraded condition and the options available to him. "Chun, how much control do I actually have? Can I count on the engines to keep running through landing?" Sarah's response was honest but encouraging, based on her intimate knowledge of the electrical failures that were occurring. "The engines should continue to run as long as you don't demand rapid power changes. The electrical faults are affecting control systems, not the basic engine operation. You'll need to plan your approach very carefully, but the aircraft is still flyable." The technical discussion between Sarah and Jackson was complicated by the need to coordinate with air traffic control and emergency procedures. The tower was managing the emergency response while trying to understand the specific nature of 774's problems. Sarah's explanations provided crucial insight into the aircraft's condition and capabilities. Tower, based on maintenance. Input, I'm dealing with electrical control failures, but the engines are still producing thrust, Jackson reported. I'm going to need a long, straight-in approach with minimal power changes. Request vectors to a 10-mile final for runway 05. The tower's approval was immediate, recognizing that Jackson's specific approach requirements were based on his aircraft's unique emergency condition. Emergency vehicles were positioned along the runway, and crash and rescue crews were briefed on the nature of the electrical failures that were causing the emergency. Sarah's guidance to Jackson became increasingly detailed as the pilot began his approach to the airfield. Her understanding of the electrical system failures allowed her to predict how the aircraft would behave under different conditions and provide specific recommendations for managing the degraded systems. Jackson, when you extend landing gear, you may see additional electrical warnings, Sarah advised. The gear motors draw significant power and could trigger more system failures. Be prepared for that, but the gear should still extend and lock normally. The approach phase was the most critical part of Jackson's emergency, as the electrical problems that had been manageable during cruise flight could become catastrophic during the high workload operations required for landing. Sarah's real-time analysis of the aircraft's condition provided Jackson with the confidence he needed to continue the approach despite multiple system failures. Jackson's professional calm was evident as he managed the complex approach procedures while dealing with an aircraft that was barely responding to normal control inputs. "Chen, I'm showing gear down and locked, but I'm getting master caution lights across the board. How much should I trust these indications?" Sarah's response was based on her detailed knowledge of which electrical systems were affected by the wire harness failures and which remained reliable. "Trust your primary flight instruments and basic engine parameters. The warning systems are compromised, but the essential flight controls should still be functional. Focus on airspeed and altitude control." The final approach was a masterpiece of pilot skill guided by Sarah's technical expertise. Jackson managed the aircraft's degraded systems with precision, maintaining proper approach parameters despite the lack of normal engine control authority. Sarah's continuous guidance provided him with the information he needed to compensate for the electrical failures. "Jackson, as you reduce power for landing, the engines may not respond immediately to throttle inputs," Sarah warned. "Plan your power reductions early and be patient with the engine response. The thrust will decrease, but it may take several seconds longer than normal." The landing itself was smooth and professional, a testament to Jackson's skill and Sarah's guidance. 774 touched down on the runway Centrin and rolled out normally, though Jackson reported that the engines were not responding to his attempts to reduce thrust for taxi operations. "Tower, 774 is down safely, but I have no throttle control for taxi. The engines are still running at approach power settings. I'm going to need a tug to get this bird to the ramp." The relief in the hangar was palpable as Jackson's aircraft came to a stop on the runway, safely recovered despite the catastrophic electrical failures that had threatened to make it unflyable. Sarah's expert guidance had been instrumental in the successful outcome, transforming her from a dismissed maintenance technician into the person who had saved a pilot's life. But even as the immediate emergency was resolved, Sarah knew that 774's problems were far from over. The electrical failures that had caused the flight emergency were symptoms of deeper systemic issues that could affect other aircraft in the fleet. Her months of investigation had revealed patterns that suggested the problem was not isolated to a single aircraft. The post-flight inspection of 774 revealed the full extent of the electrical system damage that Sarah had been documenting. The wire harnesses that controlled the engine systems were completely destroyed, their insulation melted and their connections fused by the thermal stress of repeated electrical faults. The aircraft was a total loss from an electrical systems perspective, requiring complete rewiring before it could fly again. Jackson's debriefing confirmed every aspect of Sarah's technical analysis and predictions. The electrical failures had occurred exactly as she had warned, progressing from minor anomalies to complete system breakdown in the precise manner that her engineering knowledge had indicated. The pilot's description of the aircraft's behavior matched her theoretical models perfectly. "The starboard engine just stopped responding to throttle inputs about 40 minutes into the flight," Jackson reported. "I could hear it running normally, but when I moved the throttle, nothing happened. Then the port engine started showing similar symptoms. If Chen hadn't been there to guide me through the approach, I don't know if I could have gotten this bird down safely. Sarah's vindication was complete and undeniable, but it came with the sobering realization that her warnings could have prevented the emergency entirely. The electrical problems that had nearly caused a catastrophic accident had been developing for months, documented in detail by someone whose expertise had been consistently dismissed by the maintenance and operational hierarchy. The investigation that followed Jackson's emergency landing focused not only on the technical failures that had caused the crisis, but also on the institutional failures that had allowed those problems to persist. Sarah's documentation became the cornerstone of the analysis, providing a detailed timeline of how the electrical faults had developed and why her warnings had been ignored. Commander Williams, the operations officer, found herself in the difficult position of explaining why an aircraft with documented safety problems had been allowed to continue flying. Sarah's months of reports provided clear evidence that the electrical issues were serious and progressive, yet the operational decisions had consistently prioritized flight schedules over safety concerns. Petty Officer Chen's analysis was thorough and accurate, Williams acknowledged in her preliminary report. The electrical failures occurred exactly as she predicted, following the timeline and failure modes that she had documented. Her warning should have been taken more seriously, and immediate action should have been taken to ground the aircraft. The broader implications of Sarah's vindication extended far beyond 774's immediate problems. Her analysis had revealed systemic issues that could affect multiple aircraft in the fleet, raising questions about the adequacy of current maintenance procedures and inspection protocols. The electrical problems she had identified were not unique to a single aircraft but reflected design vulnerabilities that could manifest throughout the Super Hornet fleet. Sarah's transformation from dismissed technician to recognized expert happened with startling speed as the full scope of her knowledge became apparent to the squadron's leadership. Her months of investigation had produced a comprehensive understanding of electrical system vulnerabilities that exceeded the knowledge of more senior personnel. The technical briefing that Sarah provided to the squadron's leadership was a masterpiece of engineering analysis, combining theoretical knowledge with practical understanding of how complex systems fail under operational stress. Her presentation revealed not only what had happened to 774, but also what could happen to other aircraft if similar problems were not identified and corrected. The electrical system design has a fundamental vulnerability in the wire harness routing, Sarah explained to the assembled officers. The thermal environment in the engine bay causes gradual insulation degradation that accelerates over time. The problem is not immediately obvious during routine inspections, but it leads to catastrophic failure under flight conditions. The squadron commander's response to Sarah's briefing reflected the significant shift in how her expertise was perceived within the organization. Petty Officer Chen, your analysis has identified a fleet-wide safety issue that could have resulted in multiple aircraft losses. I'm directing that all Super Hornets in the squadron undergo immediate inspection using the procedures you've developed. Sarah's new role as the squadron's leading expert on electrical system problems was both professionally satisfying and personally overwhelming. The same detailed knowledge that had been dismissed as excessive caution was now recognized as essential expertise that could prevent future accidents. Her months of isolation and frustration had been transformed into a position of respect and authority. The fleet-wide inspection program that followed Sarah's recommendations revealed that 774's problems were indeed not isolated. Multiple aircraft showed similar patterns of electrical system degradation, though none had progressed as far toward complete failure. Sarah's inspection procedures identified dozens of aircraft that required immediate electrical system repairs. The scope of the problem that Sarah had uncovered was staggering in its implications for fleet readiness and safety. Without her persistent investigation and technical expertise, The electrical vulnerabilities could have remained hidden until multiple catastrophic failures occurred during flight operations. Her work had potentially prevented numerous accidents and saved countless lives. The recognition that Sarah received for her role in identifying and resolving the electrical system crisis was unprecedented for someone of her rank and experience. Her technical expertise had proven more valuable than the operational experience of more senior personnel, demonstrating that engineering knowledge and careful analysis could provide insights that intuition and experience might miss. The Navy's response to Sarah's discoveries included not only immediate fleet inspections but also long-term changes to maintenance procedures and training programs. Her methods for detecting electrical system problems were incorporated into standard inspection protocols, ensuring that future technicians would have the tools needed to identify similar problems before they became critical. Sarah's documentation of the electrical system vulnerabilities became the foundation for engineering changes that would improve the reliability and safety of the entire Super Hornet fleet. Her months of detailed investigation had produced insights that would benefit naval aviation for years to come, transforming a potential fleet-wide safety crisis into an opportunity for systematic improvement. The personal satisfaction that Sarah felt from her vindication was tempered by the knowledge that her warnings could have prevented Jackson's emergency entirely. The institutional dynamics that had dismissed her concerns had nearly resulted in a catastrophic accident, highlighting the importance of listening to technical experts regardless of their rank or experience level. But as Sarah stood in the hangar, watching 774 undergo the extensive electrical system repairs that she had recommended months earlier, she knew that her persistence had ultimately served its purpose. The aircraft that had nearly killed its pilot was being transformed into a safer and more reliable machine, and the lessons learned from its problems would protect future aviators throughout the fleet. The crisis that had begun with dismissed warnings and institutional skepticism had ended with Sarah's emergence as a recognized expert whose knowledge would shape the future of naval aviation maintenance. Her quiet persistence had been vindicated in the most dramatic way possible, proving that technical expertise and careful analysis could overcome institutional bias and operational pressure. The transformation was complete, but Sarah knew that her real work was just beginning. The electrical system problems she had identified were only the beginning of what promised to be a comprehensive review of aircraft maintenance procedures and safety protocols. Her expertise would be essential to ensuring that similar problems were identified and resolved before they could threaten the safety of naval aviators. 3 weeks after Jackson's emergency landing, Sarah stood before a packed auditorium at the Naval Aviation Technical Training Center, facing an audience of senior officers, chief petty officers, and maintenance professionals from across the fleet. The PowerPoint presentation behind her displayed the intricate electrical schematics that had once been dismissed as overcomplicated theoretical concerns, now recognized as the blueprint that had prevented a catastrophic accident and saved countless future lives. Admiral Richardson, commander of Naval Air Forces Atlantic, sat in the front row, his expression one of respectful attention as Sarah explained the technical details that had been overlooked for months. The same analysis that had been rejected by supervisors and mocked by colleagues was now being presented as essential knowledge that would reshape maintenance procedures throughout naval aviation. The key insight, Sarah explained to the assembled experts, was recognizing that electrical system degradation follows predictable patterns. When you understand the thermal and mechanical stresses involved, the failures weren't random anomalies, but systematic progressions that could be detected and prevented with proper diagnostic procedures. Her voice carried quiet confidence as she addressed questions from officers whose rank and experience far exceeded her own. The technical knowledge that had once isolated her from her peers had become the foundation of her authority in this new role. The months of detailed documentation and persistent investigation had transformed her From an overlooked technician into a recognized expert whose insights were reshaping naval aviation safety. The presentation concluded with a comprehensive overview of the fleet-wide inspection program that had grown from Sarah's initial warnings about 774. The scope of the electrical problems discovered across multiple aircraft had validated her concerns about systemic vulnerabilities, leading to immediate grounding actions and extensive retrofit programs that would cost millions of dollars, but save immeasurable lives. After the formal presentation, Admiral Richardson approached Sarah personally, his demeanor reflecting genuine respect for her technical expertise and professional courage. Petty Officer Chen, your work has identified the most significant safety issue we've faced in years. The fleet is safer because you refused to accept easy answers when you knew something was wrong. Sarah's response was characteristically humble, her focus remaining on the technical aspects rather than personal recognition. Thank you, sir. The most important thing is that we've prevented future accidents and improved the reliability of our aircraft. The work continues with the retrofit program and enhanced training procedures. The Admiral's smile showed appreciation for Sarah's professional attitude and technical focus. I understand you've been offered several opportunities for advancement and specialized assignments. Have you given thought to where you'd like your career to lead? The opportunities that had emerged from Sarah's vindication were extensive and varied. Engineering commands wanted her expertise for design analysis and failure investigation. Training centers sought her knowledge for instructor positions. Research facilities offered positions developing new diagnostic procedures and maintenance technologies. The same detailed knowledge that had once made her an outsider now made her one of the most sought-after technicians in naval aviation. But Sarah's answer reflected her fundamental commitment to hands-on maintenance work and practical problem-solving. I'd like to stay involved in fleet maintenance, sir. There's still a lot of work to be done improving our diagnostic capabilities and training technicians to identify problems before they become critical. The weeks following Jackson's emergency had transformed not only Sarah's professional standing, but also the culture within her maintenance community. The same colleagues who had once dismissed her concerns now sought her guidance on complex technical problems. Her workstation had become an informal center of learning where experienced technicians came to understand the engineering principles behind the maintenance procedures they had been following by rote. Chief Rodriguez's relationship with Sarah had evolved from skeptical supervision to respectful collaboration. His acknowledgement of the errors in judgment that had nearly led to catastrophe was honest and professional, reflecting the integrity that had made him an effective leader despite his initial dismissal of Sarah's warnings. I learned a hard lesson about listening to technical expertise, regardless of who it comes from, Rodriguez admitted during a private conversation with Sarah. Your persistence saved lives, and I should have taken your concerns more seriously from the beginning. Sarah's response showed the grace and professionalism that had characterized her approach throughout the crisis. The important thing is that we learn from what happened and improve our procedures. The technical knowledge has to be balanced with operational experience, and that means better communication between all levels of the maintenance organization. The collaboration between Sarah and Rodriguez had produced significant improvements in maintenance procedures and training programs. Her technical insights were now integrated with his operational experience to create more effective diagnostic protocols and inspection procedures. The partnership demonstrated how different types of expertise could be combined to improve safety and efficiency. The broader impact of Sarah's discoveries extended far beyond her immediate squadron. The electrical system vulnerabilities she had identified were found in aircraft across multiple commands, leading to a comprehensive review of maintenance procedures and training programs throughout naval aviation. Her methods for detecting and analyzing system degradation became standard practice for maintenance organizations worldwide. The retrofit program that emerged from Sarah's analysis was one of the largest maintenance initiatives in recent naval Aviation history. Every Super Hornet in the fleet underwent extensive electrical system modifications based on her recommendations, a massive undertaking that required coordination between multiple commands and contractors. The program's success was measured not only in improved aircraft reliability, but in the prevention of accidents that could have cost lives and aircraft. Sarah's role in the retrofit program was central, but characteristically focused on technical excellence rather than personal recognition. She worked directly with engineering teams to develop improved wire harness designs, consulted with training organizations to create better diagnostic procedures, and collaborated with field maintenance units to ensure that the modifications were implemented correctly. The technical papers that Sarah published based on her investigation became required reading for maintenance professionals throughout the military and civilian aviation communities. Her analysis of electrical system failure modes and diagnostic procedures was recognized as a significant contribution to aircraft safety and reliability engineering. But perhaps the most significant impact of Sarah's work was the cultural change it produced within the maintenance community. Her example demonstrated that technical expertise and careful analysis could identify problems that experience and intuition might miss. Young technicians throughout the fleet were encouraged to question procedures, investigate anomalies, and document their findings with the same thoroughness that had characterized Sarah's approach. The recognition that Sarah received for her contributions included formal awards and commendations, but the personal satisfaction came from knowing that her work had prevented future accidents and improved the safety of naval aviation. The months of frustration and isolation had been transformed into a legacy of improved procedures and saved lives. Lieutenant Commander Jackson's gratitude was expressed not only in formal commendations, but in his ongoing advocacy for the importance of listening to maintenance professionals. His experience during the emergency had given him profound appreciation for the technical expertise that kept aircraft flying safely, and he became an influential voice for supporting thorough maintenance procedures and investigation protocols. Sarah Chen saved my life, Jackson stated during testimony to a safety review board. But more importantly, her work is going to save the lives of future aviators who will never know how close they came to experiencing the same emergency I faced. The demonstration flight that had originally been scheduled for 774 was eventually conducted using a different aircraft, but the real demonstration had already occurred. Sarah's expertise had been proven under the most demanding circumstances possible, validating years of education and months of investigation. In a crisis that tested every aspect of her technical knowledge. The evening after her presentation to the Fleet Maintenance Conference, Sarah returned to her quarters with a sense of completion that had been absent during the months of investigation and crisis. The work that had begun with dismissed warnings and phantom problems had concluded with recognition, respect, and systemic changes that would improve safety throughout naval aviation. Her small apartment was quiet and orderly, reflecting the same attention to detail that characterized her professional work. The technical manuals and maintenance documents that covered her desk represented ongoing projects and continuing education, evidence that her commitment to excellence remained unchanged despite her elevated status within the organization. Sarah's reflection on the events that had transformed her career was thoughtful and measured. The vindication she had received was professionally satisfying, but the real reward was knowing that her persistence had prevented future accidents and improved the safety of aircraft and aircrew throughout the fleet. The phone calls from former colleagues and new professional contacts had increased dramatically as word of her expertise spread throughout the aviation community. Job offers arrived regularly from military and civilian organizations, seeking her knowledge of aircraft systems and diagnostic procedures. But Sarah's commitment remained with naval aviation and the hands-on maintenance work that had given her the insights necessary to identify critical problems. The next morning brought new challenges and opportunities as Sarah returned to the maintenance hangar where her journey had begun. 774 sat in the same location where she had first discovered the electrical problems that had nearly caused catastrophe, but the aircraft was now undergoing the complete electrical system replacement that she had recommended months earlier. The work proceeding on 774 represented more than just repair of a single aircraft. It was the implementation of lessons learned through careful investigation and professional courage, evidence that technical expertise and persistence could overcome institutional bias and operational pressure. The aircraft that had nearly killed its pilot was being transformed into a safer and more reliable machine. Sarah's role in overseeing the retrofit work was both technically demanding and personally satisfying. Her detailed knowledge of the electrical system problems guided every aspect of the repair process, ensuring that the modifications addressed not only the immediate failures but also the underlying vulnerabilities that had caused them. The young technicians working under Sarah's guidance approached their tasks with an appreciation for the importance of thorough investigation and careful documentation. Her example had demonstrated that attention to detail and persistence could identify problems that others missed, encouraging a new generation of maintenance professionals to question assumptions and trust their technical knowledge. The transformation was complete but ongoing. Sarah's expertise continued to shape maintenance procedures and training programs throughout naval aviation, but her fundamental approach remained unchanged. She was still the careful, thorough technician who noticed details that others missed. But now her insights were valued and implemented rather than dismissed and ignored. As Sarah reviewed the progress reports from the fleet-wide retrofit program, she felt satisfaction in knowing that her work had produced lasting improvements in aircraft safety and reliability. The electrical system problems that had threatened 774 and similar aircraft throughout the fleet were being systematically identified and corrected, preventing future emergencies and saving lives. The recognition she had received was meaningful, but the real reward was in the knowledge that her persistence and technical expertise had made naval aviation safer for everyone involved. The months of dismissed warnings and institutional skepticism had been transformed into a legacy of improved procedures and prevented accidents. The quiet strength that had sustained Sarah through months of professional isolation continued to guide her approach to new challenges and opportunities. Her expertise was now recognized and respected, but her commitment to technical excellence and safety remained the driving force behind her work. The aircraft around her represented not only machines to be maintained, but lives to be protected. Through careful attention to detail and thorough investigation of potential problems, Sarah's understanding of this responsibility had driven her persistence through months of dismissal and skepticism, and it continued to motivate her work as she helped reshape maintenance procedures throughout naval aviation. The story that had begun with dismissed warnings and phantom problems had concluded with recognition, respect, and systemic changes that would protect aircrew and aircraft for years to come. Sarah's quiet expertise had been vindicated in the most dramatic way possible, proving that technical knowledge and professional courage could overcome institutional bias and save lives. Her legacy lived in the improved procedures, enhanced training programs, and prevented accidents that resulted from her investigation and persistence. The work continued, but the foundation had been established for safer and more reliable aviation. Through the efforts of someone who refused to accept easy answers when lives were at stake. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.